started, why don't you meet me on slide number 2. At the end of lecture number 8, I had you guys watch video about PTSD so you can kind of see how the symptoms manifest themselves in individuals. I don't know where he's going. I'm going to go close my door. Give me 1 second. Okay. This guy's getting very mobile, so I'm not sure where he's going to wind up if I don't close that door. At least I can keep him confined to this room. Okay, so I had you guys watch a video last time so you could see how PTSD manifests itself when people experience it. And wow, he just jumped down off my bed. He's getting really, really, really brave for a little guy. All right, so today I want to start talking about things like risk factors. So I mentioned last class, one of the mysteries about something like PTSD is that on the one hand, it's the only disorder that has a specific triggering incident as the cause of the symptomology. And on the other hand, we cannot predict with perfect accuracy who will develop PTSD and who will not, just on the basis of the particular types of incidences or experiences that they've had. Whatever that triggering event is, it doesn't mean everyone's going to develop PTSD. So the question is, why? It isn't clear at this point. You know, PTSD, as I mentioned in the prior class, is a relatively new in terms of diagnosis disorder, in terms of when others were in the DSM, right? Really, it wasn't until the Vietnam War and people started coming back from the Vietnam War and showing a constellation of symptoms that the clinical system even became aware of this, right? So we still don't really know why some people develop PTSD in response to a triggering traumatic incident and others do not. It is true, as we'll talk a little bit more about today, that the more severe or long-lasting the trauma, the greater the chance PTSD will develop. But there is no perfect predictor. Even the most severe, most long-lasting, they don't always end in post-traumatic symptomology. We really need more research to better predict who is at risk given a traumatic triggering incident and why. Perhaps certain predispositions that people come into the world with, either genetically or early life experiences. So it could be genetically determined that people have genes that make their stress response system more easily activated, or it could be something like early life experiences of trauma or stress. So when I say predisposition, I don't always mean something hereditary or biologic. It could be biological, it could be a learned response, it could be experiences people have early in life. We do know from research that people who develop PTSD tend to have a history of other prior stressful or traumatic experiences before the one that causes the disorder takes place. So maybe that accumulation of stressors or traumatic incidences makes PTSD more likely in the future if a traumatic incident takes place then. It could be because prior accumulation of trauma or stress makes the fight or flight system, did I say SISM? That's not a word. Let's try that again. The fight or flight system of the body, perhaps early accumulation of stressors prior to the triggering event that causes PTSD, sensitizes the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, so that by the time that triggering incident happens, the system was already highly reactive. It could be that. It could be that early traumatic incidences or an accumulation of prior stressors kind of increases your fight or flight's baseline level of arousal. So the very next thing that happens, the system is kind of pushed over the edge, so to speak. And they're sort of always ready for fight or flight. We do know that areas of the brain that are involved in the fight or flight stress response remain more active in the future if a person experiences long-term stress or trauma. And we're going to talk more about brain areas later today in this class. We also know research suggests that the development of PTSD, I literally just said PTSD. That is not a thing. Take two, let's try this again. Research suggests that the development of PTSD appears to depend on the nature of the traumatic event. Whether or not the person views the event with intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So if people experience the traumatic event with a greater degree of terror, a greater degree of fear. And we also know vulnerability and predisposing factors play a role. Some of these have to do with prior psychiatric history. Some have to do with other life events. Now, these are not absolutes. So, for example, if the event itself is extremely severe, extremely traumatic, that can override some of the other factors that increase somebody's risk, like predisposing vulnerabilities or the nature of the event. Coping style can override the effect of trauma. So certain coping styles make people more or less likely to develop PTSD. Situational factors like social support or the presence of other life stressors can increase or decrease someone's chances of developing PTSD. Personality style matters. Certain personality types are at greater risk for developing PTSD if they experience a traumatic incident. Some are at lowered risk of developing PTSD if they experience a traumatic incident. So let's kind of go over these in a little bit more detail before I move on to the next slide. As far as who will develop PTSD, slide number 2, severity of trauma. So I've been saying that. While it is true, the more severe the trauma, the greater risk of developing PTSD, it is not a perfect predictor because not everybody who experiences severe trauma will develop PTSD. Even though generally the more severe the trauma, the harder it is to treat and the longer symptoms will last. So we do know that while severity of event doesn't guarantee PTSD will develop, more severe events are more likely to cause PTSD. The symptoms tend to be more intense. They last longer. They are harder to intervene with successfully. A lifetime of post-traumatic stress disorder is not uncommon, for example. After a particularly brutal combat experience for people who are veterans of combat and have been in that combat situation for lengthy periods of time. Keep in mind, some people have done several tours, like some people who served in Iraq and Afghanistan did several tours, coming back, going back again, coming home, going back again, multiple times. Some spent multiple years in war zones. The nature of the event also matters. So if we could take a moment to go to slide number 3, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by the nature of the event could increase chances of developing PTSD? Well, look at slide number 3, characteristics of events that increase PTSD risk. You will see 5. Sorry, I'm a little punchy today. You will see 5 items listed there, and I want to talk about that. Lethality and or perceived threat. Lethality means something that can kill you. So an event that is perceived by the person experiencing it as having high lethality, meaning the potential to kill them is high, or the threat potential to harm them in some way is high. That increases chances of developing PTSD. Proximity means how close you are to the traumatic incident. The closer you are to it, the greater the chance you will develop PTSD. Duration, okay, so the longer lasting your exposure to the traumatic incident, the greater your chances, here's my kitty, he's under my feet, of developing PTSD. Also, one incident versus repeated traumas increases your chances of developing PTSD. So that's why combat situations increase risk, because people are repeating the traumatic experience over and over and over again. Same with abuse. If people are in a long-lasting abusive relationship, long-lasting abuse by a parent, those things increase risk of PTSD. Number 4, intentionality or controllability. What this refers to is whether or not the individual believes the incident, the traumatic incident he or she experienced was controllable by them. The less controllable the event is perceived to be, the greater the risk of developing PTSD, because the person doesn't believe in the future they will be able to prevent it from happening again. And when they're in the incident, they felt they had very low levels of control over what was happening to them. Finally, number 5, in terms of the nature of the event, we have expected versus unexpected. Unexpected traumatic events have a greater risk of leading to post-traumatic symptomology than expected traumatic events. So if something happens to you that you in no way could possibly have forecasted, that is likely to develop into PTSD symptoms more so than something you could have prepared for. So while it is true that when people go to combat, for example, if they're there for lengthy periods of time and the experience is high lethality and the duration is long, things like that, the chances of PTSD are higher than if those things weren't there. But on the other hand, there are cases where people who are going into combat and they know they're going, right, they've chosen to serve in the military. And so to some extent, those are expected traumas and they have some opportunity to prepare for them or train for them. And that can lessen the chances of PTSD. These are not perfect predictors. I have to say that again. These are not perfect predictors. In some cases, all 5 of these things are present and people don't develop PTSD. In other cases, maybe 1 is, and people do develop PTSD. These are not perfect. We're talking about sort of the majority of people, the aggregation of data that we have. What are the factors that emerge as being most predictive? And in general, although it doesn't hold for everybody, the more of these that are present, the greater the risk of developing PTSD. So let's go back to slide number 2 for a moment. Predisposition. I talked a little bit about this, but I just want to clarify it a little bit further. When you have a predisposition or predisposing factor, that means something happened to you or you have a characteristic that puts you at higher risk than someone else before the traumatic incident takes place. Okay? So in this case, we're saying, what are some things that people could have, either characteristics they have or experiences or genetics or biological characteristics, that prior to exposure to a traumatic incident puts them at greater risk for PTSD than someone else if they experience a trauma. Biologic or genetic, I talked a little bit about this. What I was referring to earlier was something we call higher inborn reactivity. I've talked about reactivity in prior lectures when we were talking about fear responsivity, when we were talking about areas of the brain that are signaling fear. We talked a little bit about fight or flight, all of this when we talked about panic and anxiety. Same idea here. Some people come into the world with genetically determined, heritable, higher inborn reactivity, which again means their stress response system in their brain, in their physiology, is at a heightened level compared to other people. So smaller things can trigger those responses. Personality style has also been shown to play some role in risk. Trait anxiety, neuroticism, and external locus of control, as well as low resiliency, increase risk of developing PTSD in the face of trauma. So what do these things mean? Trait anxiety is contrasted with state anxiety, right? So state anxiety means a person might be anxious in a specific situation, but they're not a generally anxious person. Trait anxiety means regardless of the situation the person's in, that person tends to be an anxious person, okay? Trait is part of their sort of fabric of who they are. People who have that characteristic are at greater risk for developing PTSD if trauma happens to them. Neuroticism means that neuroticism is a personality characteristic. People who score high on neuroticism tend to have more experiences of negative emotional states like depression, anxiety, anger, and they also have what we refer to as labile mood. And I should type that in here, so I'm going to. Labile mood. Labile mood means instability of mood. It means a person's mood states shift rapidly from one state to another state. So they could be happy, then angry, then anxious, then sad. They have a lot of shifting of emotion. They don't have a steady state emotion. Those folks are at greater risk for post-traumatic stress disorder in the face of trauma. Hold on one second. Silas, leave the kitty alone. He's jealous of the little kitty. Sorry, he's just my big baby. 6-year-old golden retriever. He has other cats who live here, but this is a newbie. He's like, who's this newbie hanging out in my house with my mama? Anyway, external locus control puts people at greater risk for trauma-related PTSD than internal locus of control. Locus of control refers to, generally speaking, who or what do you think impacts the things that happen to you? External locus of control means, generally speaking, you believe you have very little impact on the things that happen to you. It's luck, it's powerful other people, but it's not you. Internal locus of control means you're the kind of person who tends to believe that when things happen to you, they are under your control, meaning you've made choices, you've made effort, you've made decisions that put you in those circumstances. The less you believe you have an internal impact, the more of an externalized locus of control you have, the greater your risk for developing PTSD in the face of trauma. Finally, low resiliency versus hardiness. When people are resilient or hardy, that means they have certain personality characteristics that protect them from stress. If you're resilient, right? Resilient, bounce back. People who have very high resiliency are people who seem to be able to weather the storms in their life fairly well. They might, have some difficulty, but they never get thrown off. They never are thrown off their goals. Their mood state remains stable regardless of these difficulties. They seem to be able to grow from those experiences rather than become saddened by them, or rather than become disillusioned. So people who have low levels of resiliency or hardiness are more likely to develop PTSD when a traumatic incident takes place. People who score high on these measures are more protected from post-traumatic stress disorder if trauma happens, okay? And finally, history, like I said before, a history of prior stressful or traumatic experiences seems to be associated with greater risk of PTSD when a trauma happens. Now, again, this could be the reason I said earlier. It could be biologic, that the accumulation of stressors in your life lead to a greater sensitivity or vigilance in your fight or flight system. And so it just takes kind of one more thing, right? One more traumatic incident to kind of push the system over the edge, so to speak, and sort of flood the system and dysregulate it. The brain areas involved in the stress response, as you already know, that fear response network, we're going to come back to this later in class today, those may be sensitized by prior traumatic experiences. So we're going to come back to this a little bit later in class. One of the types of prior traumatic or stressful experiences that seems to correlate with risk for PTSD later is childhood abuse and neglect. Childhood abuse and neglect. In fact, that's discussed in the DSM-5 with regard to post-traumatic stress disorder and acute distress disorder, but predominantly post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so I'm going to end this here, and we're going to meet up on the next video to talk a little bit more about some additional risk factors. See you soon. If I can find my Zoom link. There it is. All right.